So, you want to build a console killer PC in 2021? Well, sorry, it ain't happening. The market forces just aren't aligned to make it feasible. The world is going tech crazy right now, and that means inflated prices and near zero availability. Sorry, but that's how it is in the scalper pandemic. But okay, you look disappointed. You saw the clippy, you clicked the thumbnail and thought, this guy might have some answers. Well, let's talk hypothetically for a minute. How does this new console generation redefine console killers, and how does the budget PC community respond? What needs to happen for a 9th gen console killer to become a reality? If for some reason you clicked on this video but haven't heard of a console killer, here's a quick rundown. In its simplest terms, a console killer PC can equal or outperform a console in the same games for the same money or less, while still being a practical PC. It's not unusual for console killer builds to lean pretty heavily on used or refurbished high-end parts, or old server components in a pinch. You might argue that a PC can't compete with a console, but frankly that's not an argument I'm here for today. As far as I'm concerned, the concept of a console killer is a way of framing a budget gaming PC, and not literally a device to completely replace a console. You won't hear me disagreeing that PS5s and Xbox Series offer a superior couch gaming experience, incredible value for money, and unbeatable convenience, but that's not what this video is about. So put down the knife and let's talk about this. The previous generation of console killers coasted on a few assumptions. First, that we didn't need an optical drive, second, that physical space wasn't an issue, and third, that the gamer was happy to play games from a desktop. Most console killers focus more on matching console performance and gaming experience than practicality, and, if we're being real, beating console gamers in arguments on the internet. While I'd like to think it was possible to build a PC that could match a console both in value and utility, I damn near destroyed my brain trying to find a good console-like user interface for PC that unified games across launchers without needing a mouse and keyboard. So yes, I'm once more asking you to forget that PCs are terrible at couch gaming. To build a console killer, we need it to fit the following criteria. It must have an 8-core processor capable of simulating 16 logical cores with approximately the same single-thread performance as an AMD 3000 series CPU. It must have at least 16 gigs of total memory available across system RAM and video RAM. It must have approximately 1 TB of solid-state storage. It must have a graphics processor capable of convincingly rendering a 4K image from a reasonable distance, and that can process ray tracing effects at least as well as an AMD RX 6700 XT. And, most importantly, it must cost $400 or less. Now, I know what you're thinking. Series X is $500, only the PS5 digital edition's $400. Yes, that's right, but if I said we had a budget of $500, were you thinking about using that extra $100 to buy an optical drive? Now, be honest. The CPU is the first major hurdle. We can only really allocate $80 to this part of the build. From the current pool of available tech, there are a few good candidates based on performance. There's AMD's Ryzen series of CPUs, several of which have the right number of threads but lack the per-thread performance of the consoles. Pre-Ryzen AMD processors have no SMT, and also aren't likely to be competitive on single-core performance, so without spending extra on an overclocking-capable motherboard and improved cooling, we're most likely looking at the Ryzen 7 3700X, or its APU equivalent, the 4750G. From Intel we have a few more options. As well as the current and previous generation i7s, the 9th gen Core i9 from the desktop platform also offers 8 cores and 16 threads. There are also several options from the professional and HEDT platforms dating back to the mid-2010s that could potentially meet the thread count requirement, though most are unlikely to have the clock speeds or per-thread performance to fit the bill, and those that do have retained more of their value so far. Now, most of the CPUs I've just mentioned cost at least half the price of a PS5 on their own. Given time though, it seems likely that, at least on the Intel front, prices on these items are likely to come down to more reasonable levels. Team Blue keeps churning out new models year on year and can usually meet demand, particularly among non-enthusiast parts, so I dare say used 9th and 10th gen non-K 8 cores will be among the first viable sub-$100 options. Enterprise models like Xeons will likely be even cheaper, but I think motherboard costs may keep them from being the meta. I suspect Ryzen CPUs are going to take longer to come down to the kind of price we want to see, mainly due to their current popularity with enthusiasts. 1000 and 2000 series CPUs are already coming down in price and are likely to continue dropping, but the 3000 series are likely to remain in demand for as long as AMD can't keep up with orders for the 5000 series. Unless supply radically improves on Ryzen 5000, it will probably remain expensive even after Ryzen 6000 launches. Future Ryzen platforms are, at this point, an open question. Will the new CPU socket pave the way for entry-level 6 and 8 core CPUs replacing 2 and 4 cores? If so, would this, plus the death of development of the AM4 socket, result in fire sale prices on used console equivalent CPUs? For the time being, all we can do is speculate. You might argue that modern games simply don't need this powerful of a CPU right now, and you might well be right, but we don't know what the future holds for game development. 8th gen console killers succeeded in part because the Jaguar CPUs were obsolete practically as soon as they released. With some pretty exceptional processors at their disposal in the 9th gen, it's easy to see a time where game developers start to leverage these extra threads in games, and ideally we want our console killer to be competitive throughout the generation. Presently, the closest graphics cards in performance to the consoles are the AMD Radeon RX 6700 XT and Nvidia RTX 3060 Ti. As AMD don't have any previous gen ray tracing support, none of their older cards are going to completely fit the bill. The closest previous gen alternatives from Nvidia would be the RTX 2080 and 2080 Super, though I'm of the opinion that we don't have to stick to the specs here. In the conclusion to my £750 not good enough build video, I surmised that cheaper cards like the RTX 3060 and RTX 2060 Super might not match the consoles on paper, but that they don't strictly need to. Consoles play pretty fast and loose with concepts like resolution and quality, and with tech like DLSS and AMD's upcoming equivalent, which I guess we're calling Fidelity FX, we don't have to stick religiously to our settings either. That being said, this is a console killer, not a bronze medalist, so to fit this into our budget we need a high-end 1st gen or mid-range 2nd gen RTX card or an RX 6700 XT or above for $130. From 2020 looking backwards, the last top-tier GPU to drop that low in price would probably be Kepler-era Nvidia and AMD's GCN 2.0. I picked up a used R9 290X for £100 in 2017, over 3 years after it was released, but I'd say it wasn't normal to get cards for that price until maybe late 2017 or early 2018. If we interpret that to the current situation, then RTX 2080s should be hitting the desired $130 price point by 2022. But that, of course, won't happen. The scalper pandemic has been a huge disruption to the market that will probably add at least a year to that estimate. That being said, there are a few left field possibilities that might shake things up. First is Intel. Team Blue have been reportedly gearing up for entry to the discrete GPU market, and if they can offer a compelling product, it might well have a knock-on effect on the competition as well as the used market. Then there's the possibility that one of the established brands releases something that eviscerates the value of their previous cards. We saw this briefly after the launch of the 3070 and 3080, when the price of the 2080 Ti crashed as people panic sold them on eBay. If AMD did something similar with RX 7000, we could once more see an exodus of people leaving RX 6000 and RTX 3000 to go to this new meta. This is, of course, pure, wild speculation on my part. And this just in from our wishful thinking department, a crypto crash. Yes, everybody still has that image of the dickhead with the mining rig in the back of his sports car burned into their brains, so we all desperately want the Ethereum bubble to pop and see people like him selling their X mining cards for pennies on the dollar. This is how we ended up with a solid few months where the used price of RX 470s and 480s was about $70 to $100 after all. I'm no expert in crypto, so I don't want to speculate too hard about the likelihood of this, but I remain hopeful. I still want a Founders Edition 3080 for my personal rig. The rest of the system will rely very much on shifting market conditions. If we can get the CPU, GPU, motherboard and RAM for say $300, it doesn't seem unrealistic to get the rest of the components for $100. Of course, that's only realistic if you say the first part quickly and quietly enough. Right now, the idea of getting those core components for $300 seems like about the most ridiculous thing in the world. Breaking it down into the individual components, as we have done so far, a 9th gen console killer won't happen without getting some major discounts. I dare say that with the natural depreciation of components over time, it won't be too long before some of these discounts become a reality, but there's a possibility that we haven't considered yet. If we could get the entirety of the PC minus the graphics card for say $200, we might be closer to killing the 9th gen than we think. Many budget PC gamers are more than familiar with the idea of the Optiplex gaming PC. In fact, I'd be surprised if there weren't more than a few people who've already said just upgrade a Prebuilt in the comments. Machines like the Dell Optiplex Mini Tower have been a key ingredient for console killer builds to date, mainly because they tend to fill office surplus stores and eBay pages, and most of them have or can easily be upgraded to a quad-core Intel i5. Contemporary pre-builts of this kind are still pretty expensive, and finding one that can support an 8-core means spending more than we can afford. If these come down in price sharply for some reason, we might be in with a shot, but rather than rely on hope and prayer, we can instead look at X-server and enterprise machines. One such example is the Dell Precision Workstation. Others include the HP Z420 Blaze It and Lenovo ThinkStation S30. These unwieldy beasts tend to work hard for a living, might be slightly louder than a PS4, and likely won't look pretty enough to sit under the TV, but as their previous owners are more likely to upgrade on a regular cycle, they're also more likely to find themselves on sale. Right now, 8-core models of the Dell T3600 and T3610, featuring Sandy Bridge E Xeons in socket 2011, can be had for under $200, and though the CPUs might well be lacking in clock speeds, there are upgrade options that could potentially bring us closer to parity with the consoles. Getting one of these for the right price could allow us substantially more money for a GPU upgrade. And look, they even have optical drives. I admit I haven't tried one of these myself yet. UK pricing isn't quite so generous, and importing one from mainland Europe comes with significant shipping costs and import duties. Fucking Nigel Farage, bastard cunt face. So I'd suggest not completely taking my word for it, and instead doing some research before settling on a specific model for a console killer project. OEM machines like these usually have some sort of caveat. It might require a proprietary motherboard power connector, or use a unique heatsink mounting assembly, or require special caddies for SSDs, though some people might do without that last one. To be clear, these aren't ideal substitutes for a custom build. 10-year-old server CPUs, even the higher clocked ones, aren't a perfect one-to-one match for Zen 2. ECC RAM is slower than non-ECC RAM by design, and anything this old isn't likely to directly support NVMe. Plus, the things are only slightly more aesthetically pleasing than water heaters. If you were to submit this to a build review from Bitwit, be prepared for a slightly racially insensitive roasting. However, unless there's a radical shift in the used PC parts landscape in the coming months, this is the closest we're going to get to a realistic platform for a 2020s console killer. I'm interested to hear your thoughts on this one. I'm sure there are options I've missed or didn't have time to talk about. Let me know in the comments. Obviously, I'm a fan of console killer builds, as you might have picked up from the other videos I've released this month. If you haven't seen them yet, there's a playlist on screen now. Kindly do the usual YouTube things if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.